Thank you. Please be seated. And if the state would call its next witness, please.
State calls Jessica Crawford to the stand.
Good afternoon. If you're willing and able to and feel you can safely and responsibly testify without a mask, that would be the preference if you can.
I can.
Thank you so much. If you would stand, my clerk will administer the oath.
Do you solemnly swear affirm the testimony you're about to give in this matter is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. Go right ahead.
Good afternoon. Could you please state your full name for the record and spell both your first and last name?
Jessica Crawford, JESSICA-CRAWFORD.
How are you employed?
I am a firearms and tool mark examiner with the Wisconsin State Crime Lab, Milwaukee Laboratory.
And what do you do as a firearms and tool mark examiner?
We examine firearms and firearm-related evidence to determine if the fired evidence was fired either in the same firearm or a particular firearm.
And how long have you been employed with this crime lab?
As a firearms examiner,
Yes.
approximately 5 years.
And did you hold any positions before you were a firearms examiner?
Yes, I did.
And what were those positions?
I was a forensic program technician.
And, okay. What is your educational background and specialized training that allows you to be a firearms examiner?
I have a Bachelor's of Science from Fort Hays State University. I have also trained in the Milwaukee Crime Lab Firearms and Tool Mark Examiner Training Program. This is a modular apprenticeship training program.
I'm going to show you two exhibits, Exhibit 403 and Exhibit 404. How would you identify Exhibit 403?
This is my statement of qualifications.
And that's what the crime lab uses instead of a curriculum vitae, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, I would move Exhibit 403 into evidence. No objection.
It is received.
And in this case, did you write a report?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and I'm going to show you what has been marked as Exhibit 404. Is that in fact a true and accurate copy of the report that you wrote in this case?
Yes, this is.
I would move Exhibit 404 into evidence at this time.
No objection.
It is received.
So when you say you're a firearms examiner, what does that mean you actually do?
When we receive firearms or firearm-related evidence into the crime lab, we examine the firearms to ensure their functionality, make sure that they work as they are intended, and test fire those firearms. When we receive fired evidence, which would be things like cartridge cases and bullets, we examine that evidence for characteristics that are both the class characteristics and individual microscopic characteristics that would allow us to determine if they were fired in the same firearm or if they were fired in a particular firearm.
And what are you looking for when you're looking at, for example, a casing that was fired and comparing it to another casing fired from a known weapon? What exactly are you looking for?
So we're looking at the markings that are left on the fired cartridge case from the firearm. We would be looking at impressions or striations that are left by things like the breech face, the firing pin, the ejector, the extractor, the chamber. These are all areas that we would look at in order to determine if they were fired in the same firearm or from a particular firearm.
So does each firearm leave unique characteristics on a casing?
Yes, it does.
So you can match them up in theory. If you have the weapon and you have the casing that was shot from it, you should be able to match them.
Correct, you should be able to.
Okay. Did you examine any evidence in this case?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And specifically, did you examine a firearm in this case?
Yes, I did.
Okay. detective gloves up and it's the firearm. I'm first going to show you the box that the firearm was in. This is 291. It's now been put into a secure carton, but if you want to look at that, does this have markings from you or your lab?
So when an item is accepted into the crime lab or submitted to the crime lab, we will give it its own unique crime lab number, and each item will receive its own unique crime lab identifier. So in this instance, there is a barcode label. That barcode label has the unique crime lab case number of M21-1575, and this is item AL.
And I think the detective is going to approach it. And Ms. Crawford, is this the weapon that you fired in connection and marked AL?
Yes, it is.
Thank you, detective. And in this case, were you also given a casing to examine? Specifically, Exhibit 284, a casing found in the Halderson home in the basement floor.
Yes, I was.
And so when you had the firearm and you were given this casing, what did you do to examine both items?
So in the examination process, once again, I function tested the firearm to make sure that it worked, that there was no damage, and that it could safely function. I functioned these safeties in order to make sure that they function as intended. And then I performed test fires of the firearm. I then took those test-fired cartridge cases and I compared them microscopically on a tool we call the comparison microscope. A comparison microscope is a microscope that is two microscopes connected by one optical bridge. What this allows for me is that I can look at those two objects simultaneously. So that was performed in order to look at those individual markings that were left over from the firearm.
And in this case, did you compare Exhibit 284 to the test rounds that you fired from the weapon? Did you say AL?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I did.
And what did you conclude in your examination?
I was able to determine that this test-fired cartridge, or this cartridge case, was fired in item AL.
And how did you come to that conclusion?
I came to that conclusion based on the different microscopic markings that I was able to identify in the breech face, the firing pin, and the ejector.
And was this case peer-reviewed and verified?
Yes, it was.
And what does that mean for your conclusion to be peer-reviewed and verified?
Peer review is when a second qualified examiner takes the paperwork and reviews it to determine that it is accurate and complete. And a verification is when a second qualified examiner takes the evidence, performs an examination, and confirms that my conclusions and the evidence are matching.
So to put it simply, a second pair of eyes looks at the data and the results and sees if they agree or not.
Yes, and the physical evidence itself.
And are all of your conclusions here today to a reasonable degree of professional certainty as practiced within your field?
Yes.
And is the lab that you work for, the Wisconsin Crime Lab, is it accredited?
Yes, it is an accredited lab.
And what does that mean?
That means that a third party oversees our policies and procedures in order to ensure that we are meeting or exceeding industry standards.
Okay, nothing further.
Cross-examination.
None, thank you.
May this witness be excused.
Yes, and released.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day. And the next witness, please.
It's going to call Laura Matson.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give in this matter is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
If you believe you can do so safely and responsibly, testifying without a mask would be our preference if you're comfortable with that. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Go right ahead.
Good afternoon. Could you please state and spell your name?
Laura Matson, Lauramatson.
And where are you employed?
The Wisconsin Department of Justice Crime Lab in Madison.
And what is your position at the crime lab?
I am an advanced latent print and footwear examiner.
How long have you been there?
I've been there since 2003.
Talk to me about what you do as a latent print examiner.
As a latent prints examiner, I examine items of evidence and process items of evidence for latent prints to determine if there are any suitable prints on an item of evidence. If there are suitable prints on those items, I will then compare them to any known standards. I can also utilize our state and FBI's automated fingerprint identification systems. I tech review and verify other examiners' work, as well as testify in court when needed. As an advanced analyst, I do more of the review process and writing of policies and procedures, as well as train new employees at the lab.
What is your educational background?
I have a Bachelor of Science from the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh in Criminal Justice, and then I attended the Waukesha County Technical College Police Academy, where I've received my law enforcement certificate.
When it comes to latent prints, what specialized training do you have?
I had very little training as a law enforcement officer in latent prints. Most of the training was on site at the crime lab, which included trainings by both senior and advanced analysts, covering examinations, how to process items, how to do comparisons, and how to come to determinations of my evaluation. It also included learning how to use our databases. And then I have also attended over approximately 300 hours of external training in latent prints.
Are you certified by any organizations?
Yes, I'm certified in latent prints by the International Association for Identification.
What is a latent print?
A latent print is generally a hidden or unseen print on an item that you would normally have to physically or chemically process in order to see it.
What is a known print?
A known print is an intentional recording of a person's friction-ridged skin. Typically, you would see something like that on a fingerprint or a palm print card, an intentional recording.
We're going to talk about some latent print work, and you did in this case, correct?
Correct.
And in addition, we're going to talk about your work as a footwear examiner too, correct?
Correct.
Tell me about your work or what you do as a footwear examiner with the lab as well.
As a footwear examiner, similar to latent prints, I, again, will examine and process items of evidence for question impressions. I will analyze images of question impressions to determine if they are suitable for comparison. And if they are suitable for comparison, I can compare them to any submitted known footwear standards. I can also utilize our footwear database and our internal reference collections. And again, I will tech review, verify other examiners' reports, and testify in court.
Similar question to your fingerprints work. What specialized training do you have to do this footwear impression work?
My footwear training involved both internal and external training as well. Internally, again, by senior and advanced analysts, and externally by certified examiners. Again, it covered processing, examinations, comparison, and evaluation decisions. And I have, in footwear, I have approximately 100 hours of external training in footwear examinations.
When it comes to both latent print analysis and footwear analysis, have you testified in court before?
Yes, I have.
Approximately how many times?
Approximately 5 in footwear and about 38 or 39 in latent prints.
I'm going to show you a couple of exhibits. We'll start with exhibit number 426. What are we looking at there?
Exhibit number 426 is my statement of qualifications.
Sure. And this somewhat details what you just talked about in some of your training and experience in this area?
That's correct.
All right. When you do latent print work or when you do footprint work, do you reduce your findings to a report?
Yes, I do.
And in this case, the case of Chandler Halderson or regarding the deceased individuals, Bart and Krista Halderson, you wrote numerous reports in this case.
Yes, I did.
Okay. I'm going to show you what's been marked. There's exhibit number 429, 430, 431, 432, 433, and 434. What I'm going to have you do is just page through those. And my question at the end is going to be, are these your reports in this case?
Okay.
And just let us know when you're done.
Yes, these all appear to be my reports.
All right. In addition to your reports, there are a number of photographs taken at the lab, and all of those items have been transmitted to my office and to the parties involved, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I'll move exhibits number 429 through 434 into evidence.
And 426?
Yes.
Any objection?
No objection.
426 and 429 through 434 are all received.
All right. And rather than having to read every one of those reports sitting here, we've created a presentation detailing some of those reports, have we not?
Yes, we have.
All right. And as 428 is in fact the printout of that presentation.
Yes, it appears to be flipping through. Yes, it does.
And 427 is just labeled as an envelope of the USB drive containing that PowerPoint.
Okay.
So I'll move 427 and 428 in evidence.
No objection.
Those are received as well.
And if we could have the HDMI left put up.
What shows on the large screen should appear on the
Oh,
computer
there it
monitor
is.
for your
Okay.
convenience.
Thank you.
So we'll start with 429, which is a report of August 17th, 2021. You examined some items in this case regarding some footwear analysis, correct?
That is correct.
What were those items?
I examined item C2 and item S, which were both tarps.
Sure. And I think the jury has seen in this giant box in a garbage can, we have item C2, which is a tarp, and item S, which we've been referring to as a barn. The barn tarp is in this giant bag right there. But for instance, if I bring you this item, are you able to take a peek at that item and let me know, for instance, is that item S?
Yes, it does have the crime lab identification of item S on it.
Got it. And that's exhibit 143. The crime lab uses its own identifying stickers on these items?
Correct.
All right. When you looked at these items, what were you looking for when you first saw them?
When I first examined them, I was in the presence of other analysts, and I was looking to see if there was any either footwear impressions or if there was any friction ridge detail, which is the detail that is on the palms of your hands or the bottoms of your feet.
At that time, did you have any shoes to compare it to, or were you just looking for if those prints were there?
I was just looking for impressions.
Sure. And you did some search for the designs of things you were finding?
That's correct.
Tell me about that.
So when there's a footwear impression, we have a database that we can use. It's called Soulmate FPX. Is one of the many databases that we can use. So if we have a question impression, if you think of the bottom of your shoe, we call that the outsole, and there's going to be a pattern on the bottom of that shoe, and that's produced by the manufacturer, and it's going to be shared by multiple shoes. When we see an impression, there are details within that impression. You know, there may be a circle or there may be triangles, and the relationship of where those are in correlation to each other, we can use that information and search our databases to see if we can find a potential shoe that did make that impression.
What type of databases are we talking about?
So Soulmate FPX is a database that is made by Foster and Freeman, and they have worked with many manufacturers and have uploaded the images into this database where we can search them. We also have just reference collections that we've made internally from shoes that we have received either from crime scenes casework or either from building our own from other analysts at the lab.
Sure. Some people bring in old shoes and donate them.
Correct. And we also can reach out to other examiners throughout the states on a forum to see if anybody else has ever seen this shoe at a scene before.
Sure. So examining C2 and S, you saw some designs that you wanted to look into further.
That's correct.
And you've personally seen these tarps in these images, correct?
Yes, I did.
And so just briefly, if we look at C2, we've been talking about it, this large box right here. There was a tarp inside of that garbage can. This is different lighting conditions, correct?
That's correct.
And this is the tarp we're talking about that has some yellow duct tape on it.
Item C2, you did, yes.
Okay. And inside the garbage can, that's what the tarp removed, correct?
That's what it removed, yes.
Just a different view of that same tarp.
Correct.
Tell me how you find these prints. Do you literally just get on your hands and knees and look? Is there a special tool you use? How does one go about this?
This is a fairly large item, so it was a little more difficult to, get to the center of it. So in this situation, we did open it up, and I was able to. The best way to sometimes see this is actually in darker, like when the room's dark versus when it's very bright. So we did dim the lights in the room, and I used what we have different. We have flashlights that have different wavelengths. So maybe a purple or maybe UV. So I utilized those flashlights to see if there was any footwear that was able to be seen using that different frequency of wavelength.
And you were able to see things.
Yes, I was.
Is this an example of what you saw in C2?
That's an example, yes.
Okay. So once you have, perhaps this, recovered from C2, what you saw, and you then start looking to see if you can find that shoe.
In this situation, I finished my additional processing, and then once these images were taken, I analyzed the images and then used the information from the images to search the databases.
And were you able to find a shoe consistent with this print?
Yes, I was.
And was that at Brooks Launch 5?
That's correct, it was.
Now, these images are just commercially available images, right, of the Brooks shoe?
Yes, they are.
They're not specific to this case?
No.
Okay. Do you sometimes rely on those commercial images in your work?
Mostly we do. In general, when we are able to find a possible outsole that made that impression, we can use just an image search online to try to give the police an investigative lead on what the uppers of the shoe may actually look like.
Okay. And so then we're going to talk about the other item, the barn tarp. Item S, same procedure. You laid it out, looked, different lighting conditions.
That's correct.
And there you found an impression as well.
That's correct. That's a processed image, yes, or impression.
And there you did some different work in this case, I would imagine, with this impression. Was it the same database, or were you able to find this image a different way?
We utilized the same databases to find the images. This was, I believe, as a reference from the Soulmate database.
Understood. So at this stage, I imagine the police haven't brought you every shoe they collected in the investigation. They were waiting to see if you found something, and then you asked them, or how does that work?
I had not received any shoes at this time. I issued the reports with these findings of the images that you just saw as an investigative lead, and then from there, shoes were submitted to the lab.
Okay. So then we have another report, October 28th, Exhibit 433. There, the police bring you some shoes that they found in the case.
Correct.
Okay. Showing you what's been marked in this case is exhibit number 359. It's been testified to be a pair of Brooks shoes, size 10.5, and we've heard about some DNA on it, but is that the item you labeled, or your lab's labeled AD, and then AD1 and AD2 for the two shoes?
Yes, it is.
When I say AD, Adam, David?
Correct.
Okay. So are these photographs of the actual shoes that you were provided from the Halderson house?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
These would be the bottoms of the shoe, the outsole design.
What do you do once you get a pair of shoes like this that appear to be possibly something that was on that tarp and you want to look at it and see if it matches? What's your process?
The first thing we do before I do any type of beyond my examination of just documenting the general condition of it is we always have it photographed so that we can have it photographed in the condition that it was received. Because the next thing that we do to help us in our comparisons is we will actually put a black powder residue, which is similar than what you probably see on crime scene shows where somebody powders for latent prints. We put that on the bottom of the shoe, and we make a clear tape lift from the bottom of the shoe, so then we can actually use that as an overlay to compare it with the question impression. So before we do any of that powder, we make sure that we do have it documented with images first.
Sure. And so here we have what's labeled as a test impression.
Correct. So the image on the right where it says test impression, that would be where I made the powder tape lift, so it was a clear overlay.
And once you have that, you're able to look at some comparisons of the original shoe print you saw on the tarp in C2, and then the shoes that you got that were purportedly from the Halderson house. You're able to compare those images.
Correct. I'll compare the images to both the standard, the physical standard, as well as the images and the overlay, the test impression.
And is that what we're looking at there?
Correct. The image on the left is a close-up picture of the question impression, which CIMP1 is what we designated that impression to be. So C stands for the item, so it was tarp item C, and then IMP is for impression 1. So this was the first impression that I compared on this item. And then the image on the right is the test impression from the known left shoe.
What are you looking for when comparing these? What types of, I imagine you're looking for abnormalities or something that is just different in both images that you could compare?
So we're looking at both similarities and differences when we're doing the comparison. The first thing that I'm going to compare is when we're looking at this, we're going to look at the outsole design, and that's going to be your general overall pattern that's on the bottom of the shoe. So we'll be looking at, and you can see pretty clearly that the pattern at the bottom of the shoe is similar. If there was they were different, at this point I could say that there is an exclusion. However, in this situation, I would go deeper and continue a back and forth comparison, also looking at the wear. In a previous image, you could see that a new shoe of a Launch 5 has, I can't really point, but you can see where there's those square blocks, and they looked like one solid large block. However, a new shoe, when you get a new Launch 5, they have 3 little dashes, kind of like when you go further down in the impression, there's 3 in a row, and some of them look like M's. So a new shoe would have that throughout the entire pattern. This shows that this area of the impression and this area of the shoe was actually worn in those areas. So those 3 hashes are kind of gone, and now they're one solid block. So that wear corresponds between CIMP1 and the wear that is shown on the bottom of the known shoe. So we'll start with looking at the wear. Then we'll also look at the design elements to make sure that they are also in the same size, they're in the same location, and they're in the same shape.
And in this case, were they of the same size, shape in general?
Yes.
And this may be an illustration of some of the defects that you were able to observe in both the item C2, the print you took off of it, and then the test impression from the shoes you were provided by the police?
Correct. So in order to make any identifications in a case, we need to have what are called randomly acquired characteristics. We call them RACs. RACs are going to be what randomly happens it's to the bottom of your shoe or the outsole as a result of a random act. So normally your shoes are going to be nice and clean when you first buy them, but the minute you walk outside, there's a chance that you're going to step on a piece of glass and potentially cut one of these design elements, or you're going to have a stone get stuck or embedded in between the design elements. So we need those types of things in order to make an identification in footwear. And again, just like with the other things, you have to have everything in correspondence, including the size, the shape, and the location of these racks.
Based on all these comparisons, you've made a chart, essentially.
That's correct.
What are we looking at there? There's a lot of letters going on. Tell us what we're looking at.
So if you look at the first column on the left, IMP number, I kind of briefly explained before, and it was C2 IMP1. So again, it would be the impression would be C2, and then IMP1 is impression 1 from that item. And then it shows the comparison decisions for either item 81 or for item 82.
Okay. And maybe a more visually pleasing way to do this is you had some findings at the end that described what you found.
Correct.
All right. So let's talk about item 81, which again, we're talking about these shoes that were provided to you by the police from the Halderson house. Were you able to determine the left shoe here? How did it relate to the print that you identified on that tarp in the garbage can as C2 impression 1?
So for C2 IMP1, I identified the left shoe to have made that impression.
It did make, you identified it to have made that impression?
Yes.
Okay. What about IMP2?
So for C2 IMP2, I again identified the left shoe to have made that impression.
What about the third impression, IMP3 on the tarp in the garbage can?
C2 IMP3, I concluded a high degree of association between the shoe, the known shoe, and the question impression.
And the fourth on the tarp inside the garbage can, C2 IMP4, what was your finding regarding that?
In C2 IMP4, I concluded there was an association of class characteristics.
Now, in addition to, we talked a little bit about your qualifications, you did some fingerprint work in this case in addition to that the work with the shoes, correct?
Correct.
And you wrote a report labeled, in this case, is exhibit number 430. You examined quite a few items here.
Yes, I did.
Talk to me a little bit about fingerprints. Does every item that's touched by the bare human hand retain fingerprints the same way and the same quality?
No, they do not.
What types of things weigh into whether fingerprints are able to be recovered in a quality fashion from an item or not?
There are a lot of things that can determine whether or not you leave prints behind. It's really a chance. We always consider it as a chance that you're going to leave prints behind. You know you touch an item several times throughout the day, but you probably don't even notice your fingerprints on that item all the time either. It can be the condition of the item, it could be the temperature, it could be how much you're potentially sweating or how dry your hands are at the time that you touch an item.
In general, what types of surfaces retain fingerprints well?
In general, it's easier to leave prints on smoother surfaces. It's more difficult to leave prints on textured surfaces.
So when we look at, for instance, in this report, the vast majority of, in the right column, is no suitable fingerprints found, essentially.
That's correct.
But there's one that's bolded there, item C2A, which is labeled piece of yellow tape removed from item C2.
Yes.
And that was, in fact, a piece of yellow duct tape removed from that tarp that was in the garbage can?
That's correct.
Okay. And you were able to identify a print there.
Yes, I was.
Is that maybe a view of that print?
Yes, as an overall view of the print.
When you got this print, you saw it, were you able to immediately make any identifications, or did you need further fingerprints from the police?
I was not able to make any identifications initially.
So you asked them for essentially better fingerprints, clearly finger-rolled or rolled fingerprints from Mr. Halderson.
That's correct.
And were you provided those?
Yes, I was.
Great. Then you wrote another report, exhibit
Yes, I did.
432. Did they provide you this item, AF?
Yes, they did.
And that's labeled in our case as exhibit number 362. Are those clearly rolled fingerprints?
Yes, there's approximately 9 or 10 pages in there. Yes.
Okay. What is different about these fingerprints than the ones that were initially provided to you?
So the first set of fingerprints that I received were from just a regular 10 print card, which you normally would see somebody had their prints taken on. However, it's more difficult to get all of the areas of your print on one of those small little squares on a fingerprint card. So after my initial comparisons, I requested additional standards so that somebody would be willing or able to take tape lifts or rolled prints that include like the tips and the sides and all areas of the palms, so that I could compare all areas of his fingers and palms to make the comparison.
And at that point, you at least, what you knew, you only had one item you were going to compare it to, which is the only item that you were able to find a recoverable print on, which was the duct tape, the piece of yellow duct tape that was on the tarp in item C2.
That's correct.
Okay. And then when they sent them to you, they also sent you an axe just to see if you'd be able to find fingerprints on it,
Yes,
and you were not.
I was not.
Did you do a comparison between the known impression from Mr. Chandler Halderson and the print that you recovered from the duct tape on the tarp?
Yes, I did.
And what are we looking at there?
So the image on the left is, again, the latent print that was on the duct tape. And the impression number is, again, C2A. That's the item it came from. FRD stands for friction ridge detail, number 1. So this is the first print on item C2A. So that is the impression photographed with the duct tape that was on the duct tape. The image on the right is the overall print from the standard that was submitted on the last, was it item AF?
Yes.
So that was what the prints looked like when it came to me. And then the smaller image is the area that I ended up focusing on in order to make an identification.
What are you looking for when you focus on an area like this?
So everybody has friction ridge detail. On the palms of your hands and on the bottoms of your feet, you have what's called friction ridge skin. And this friction ridge skin is different than the skin that you're going to find anywhere else on the rest of your body because it has raised ridges on them. And those raised ridges, when you look at them, may look like just fine lines, but under magnification, you'll actually see that these ridges have unique characteristics to them and features called minutia points. And those minutia points are where a ridge may abruptly stop and its ridge ending. It may be where one single ridge splits into two, looking like a Y, which we call a bifurcation. So everybody has those types of features within their friction ridge skin, but where they are in relationship to each other is what makes them more different and unique to each individual.
Individuals, all of us have unique fingerprints.
Correct. So when I begin looking at this, I'll do an analysis of the question impression or the friction ridge detail first. And I'm going to make note of those unique features in the print. And then when I have a known standard that I need to compare it to, I begin by looking, again, going back to those features that I marked, and I find a target group. So I'm going to look for a grouping of maybe 3 to 4 areas of friction, of those unique features, the minutia points. And I'm going to go into the known standards, and I'm going to look to see if I can find a same grouping that corresponds. If there's correspondence, I will continue to go back and forth until there's enough sufficient data to either identify or exclude.
Sure. You're looking for a lot of these different pieces of data as you do this, right?
Correct.
In fact, this is, in this case, some of those comparisons that you did?
Yes, this is the information or the data within the print that I use to support the conclusion of an identification.
Sure. And all those little dots, what do those represent?
So those dots are going to be those minutia points that I mentioned before. So the dots, if you can see clearly, may show where a ridge ends or where it may connect with another, so where one ridge becomes 2. There might be a couple dots in there as well. The circles in there where you can see with an item where I have marked A or D or F, those are going to be target groups. So when I start my comparison, I'm going to choose one of those and look for that kind of target group, and then I'm going to see if I can find those corresponding target groups in the known standard on the right. And you can see how they correspond between the two.
So were you able to draw a conclusion then from the print that you recovered on the tarp that's in the garbage can, item C2A, and then the piece of duct tape, which is FRD1, to the left ring finger of Mr. Chandler Halderson? Were you able to draw any conclusions?
Yes, I identified the left ring finger of Chandler Halderson to that impression from friction ridge detail.
No further questions?
Cross-examination?
Yes, thank you.
So I want to draw your attention to that first report. And that, I believe, was just you originally taking the tarps and seeing if you could find any kind of latent prints, correct?
For the latent prints one or the footwear one?
The footwear one.
Okay.
And you did both tarps, correct?
Yes, I did.
And I think we've identified the one in the garbage bag or the garbage bin as the C2 one. And then the other one is the barn tarp is what we've been calling it, yes?
Yes.
So for the tarp, the C2 tarp, that was where you identified those Brooks Launch 5 shoes, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And the other tarp, the barn tarp, there was another pair of shoes that you identified there, correct?
Yes. I wouldn't say identify, found and investigated a lead of a possible type of shoe that made that.
Perfect, thank you. So that's basically saying that the tread mark matches this particular type of shoe.
Or a shoe similar.
Shoe
Yes.
similar to it. And what exactly is that shoe, if you don't mind reminding us what that shoe,
Can I refer to my notes for
go
it?
for it.
Okay, so the impression on item S, I was able to locate a possible outsole bottom of the shoe that matched from a Polo Ralph Lauren.
And you're not able to identify the shoe size at this point?
No.
Okay. So later, when you did that supplemental report with the shoes that were provided to you from law enforcement, I believe you mentioned that those were the only shoes that were provided to you. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes, they were.
So you were never provided any type of Ralph Lauren shoes?
No, I was not.
Now, as far as the prints that you found on the duct tape, where on the duct tape were those prints located? On the sticky side or the outside non-sticky side?
On the non-sticky side, on the yellow portion of it.
And were you able to identify any other type of prints, or was that the only print that you were able to look at and say, ah, yes, this is a fingerprint?
That was the only one.
Were there smudges or anything else like that?
None that I noted, no.
And as far as the fingerprints and the shoe prints go, we don't know how it is that those fingerprints or shoe prints got on these objects, other than at some point someone touched them. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Now, when you were talking about, bringing you back to the footprints real quick, when you were talking about first laying out the tarps and trying to identify if there even were any footprints there, you mentioned something about using different types of light sources to get that. Is that correct?
That's correct.
At any point, did you use luminol to try to get or to try to see footprints?
No, I did not.
So to kind of put my head around it, if you will, if I just step on a surface, regardless of whether there's anything on my shoe, it's possible for me to leave a footprint.
That's correct, yes.
And again, you can't tell when exactly that shoe print was made, other than at some point I stepped there.
That's correct, yes.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Any redirect?
Nope.
May this witness be excused and released.
Yes.
I think you have some reports.
I'll grab it.
Oh, yeah.
We'll get those to the clerk. Thank you very much.
Thank
Have a
you.
good rest of your day.
You too.
Welcome, Meghann McMahon.
Do you solemnly swear affirm the testimony you're about to give in this matter is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
If you believe you can do so safely and responsibly, testifying without your mask would be our preference, unless you're not comfortable and able to do that.
I would prefer to leave my mask on.
All right, very good. Please proceed.
Could you please state and spell your name for us?
My name is Meghann McMahon. My first name is Meghhann. My last name is MC. Mahon.
And what do you do for a living?
I'm employed by the State Crime Lab in Milwaukee as a trace evidence examiner.
And while I talk, if we could have the
Sure.
screen on, and I'll have you pull that microphone just up as close as you can to you by the base. It slides. What is trace evidence?
Trace evidence is the comparison and identification of fibers, glass, fire debris analysis, and it also includes physical fit analysis.
Tell me a little bit about your educational background and your qualifications to perform this type of work.
I have a Bachelor's of Science in Spanish from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I have a Master's of Science in Forensic Science from John Jay College of Criminal Justice.
Internally at the crime lab or in your work as a trace evidence technician, what types of trainings do you undergo, or what have you done in order to learn this skill set?
To perform physical fit analysis, I completed a training program at the laboratory that included readings, hands-on exercises, mock casework, and it culminated in a competency exam.
Sure. And how long have you been doing this work?
I have been doing physical fit analysis for approximately 3.5 years.
Okay. I'm going to show you a couple things and see if you can identify them. I'm showing you what's been marked as exhibit number 419. What is that?
Exhibit 419 is a copy of my statement of qualifications.
And does that accurately describe your qualifications and educational background?
Yes.
All right. I'll move 419 into evidence.
No objection.
It is received.
Were you involved in the case involving Mr. Chandler Halderson and the deceased individuals, Krista and Bart Halderson?
Yes.
And you wrote numerous reports in this case?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to show you a few documents, and the question at the end will be, are these the reports you wrote in this case? So I'm showing you, it's been marked as exhibit number 422, 423, 424, and 425. Are these the reports you wrote in this case?
Yes, Exhibit 422 is a copy of a report from August 16th, 2021. Exhibit 423 is a copy of a report that I wrote on October 7th, 2021. And Exhibit 424 is a copy of a report that I also wrote on October 7th, 2021.
And what is exhibit number 425, if you could?
Exhibit 425 are copies of the photographs that are associated with the analyses that I did with the reports that I authored for this case.
Understood. So I will take these, and Judge, at this time, I will move exhibits 422, 423, 424, 425 into evidence.
No objection.
They are received.
And rather than reading those off, a presentation has been put together in order to display some of your photographs and your reports in this case, correct?
Yes.
And you've had an opportunity to look at that?
Yes.
And does that exhibit, is that labeled 421? Does that appear to be that presentation?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And so I'll represent to everyone that 420 is the USB drive containing the report, but I'll move 420 and 421 into evidence.
No objection.
They are received.
So we talked about your education qualifications, and we talked about trace evidence testing. You used the term physical fit analysis.
Yes.
Just a little bit, if you could, tell us how you go about performing a physical fit analysis, and if you want to use an example of a stick broken in half, what are you doing? What are you looking at there?
So with physical fit analysis, what I'm doing is I'm examining broken pieces of evidence to determine if the broken ends could fit together, if the pieces of evidence were once joined. In layman's terms, it's sort of like a forensic jigsaw puzzle.
Okay. And you performed that analysis in several items related to this case, in the State versus Chandler Halderson.
Yes.
All right. Let's talk about starting with your August 16th, 2021 report. You, in that case, or in this report, you reviewed two separate items. One, a piece of black rope recovered from the Halderson residence, and one piece of rope recovered from the torso of Mr. Halderson.
Correct.
We have some photographs just to demonstrate what you were looking at. This is one of those items. Is this one of those items?
Yes, it is.
And another photograph detailing perhaps the other one?
Correct.
Okay. One side's taped. Can you tell us why?
The side that was taped was marked non-evidence end, and that is just to indicate to me as an analyst that it was cut by the submitting agency.
So rather than bring you the whole rope, they cut off the segment they want you to look at and tape that end.
Yes.
You performed some analysis there. Tell me what your findings were.
So I examined both pieces of rope, and when I'm doing a physical fit analysis, what I'm looking for is enough detail in the broken ends to be able to see if they could fit together. In this case, I was unable to perform a physical fit analysis because there wasn't enough detail in the cut ends to determine if the pieces of rope could have fit together.
Sure. And you took some photographs of that.
The imaging unit took some photographs of it.
And that's a separate unit at the department that you work in?
Correct.
Okay. And is that a photograph of those two ends?
Yes.
Okay. And so while they might visually appear to be the same color and there's a couple different strands there, you're saying in your profession you're not comfortable making any conclusions related to that?
I wasn't able to perform physical fit analysis on these items.
Okay. Now we're going to look at exhibit number 423, a different report, this one of October 7th. You issued a couple reports on October 7th, but this is the first one. You examined some different items here. Here you had some yellow duct tape that was recovered from inside of a garbage bin, I think labeled item C by the lab, and there was item C1 and C2 inside of it, but a garbage can. There was some duct tape stuck inside of it?
Yes.
Okay. And then you had a long piece of yellow duct tape, medium piece of yellow duct tape, and a short piece of yellow duct tape. Items C2B, and C2C. Where were those items recovered from?
Those items were recovered from item C2, which was a tarp.
Those were the pieces of yellow duct tape on the tarp?
Yes.
Okay. And then you had an item called item H. Item H is labeled as a roll of yellow duct tape. And that was an actual roll of duct tape?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I'm showing you what's been marked in this case is exhibit number 283. Is that roll of duct tape that you were able to look at?
Yes.
Okay. And does that have your lab sticker on it?
Yes, and my initials are on the seal.
Understood. Thank you. So when you had all of these pieces of duct tape, what was your thought process, or what were you trying to look for there?
So what I was looking at was general physical characteristics, so the color, the width of the duct tape, and then I was looking at the torn edges of each of the pieces of duct tape, as well as the edge that was attached to the roll, to determine if there were any physical fits between any of the pieces of duct tape or any of the pieces back to the roll.
Okay. And we have some photographs of the items. I think the jury has seen this image. Exhibit 58, which has already been shown to the jury, but that's the tarp inside of the garbage can out on Irwin Road. Is that piece of duct tape that was inside of that garbage bin?
Yes,
And the next image, is that the tarp laid out with the pieces of duct tape visible on it?
yes,
And next slide, is that a closer up of one of those pieces?
yes,
Same with the next slide, just another closer up.
yes.
You removed those pieces from the tarp? Or someone did?
Somebody at the laboratory did. I did not.
Were they laid out for you for inspection?
They were previously analyzed and sent to me after the previous analyst was done with their analysis.
Things like fingerprints had to be done first?
Fingerprints would have to be done before physical fit analysis, yes.
Okay, so let's look at a couple of these pieces. C1A, one of the pieces, that's a photograph taken by the lab.
Yes,
C2A, another photograph of the other piece.
yes,
C2B, just another piece.
correct.
C2C, just another piece. Now let's talk about item, I think it was H. It was a roll of duct tape that you were provided.
Yes,
I'm showing with the jury what's been marked as exhibit number 259, image of the roll of duct tape at the Halderson home. Go back. All right. The police provided you that, and you took some, or photographs were taken of that by the lab. Here now it's labeled, of course, item H.
yes,
Okay. You performed some analysis.
yes.
Tell me what you did and what you found.
So I looked at the items visually and microscopically. I was able to connect or to determine that physical fits were present between items H, which is the roll of duct tape, item C2A, which is one of the pieces of duct tape that was on the tarp. I was able to determine that item C2A, one of the pieces of the tarp, also fit to item C2C, which was found on the tarp. And then item C2C found on the tarp, the other end physically fit to item C1A, which is the piece of duct tape from the garbage bin.
So while you just said a lot of letters and numbers, what that meant was that the roll of duct tape that we saw pictured in the exhibit found at the Halderson home connected in one continuous line with all the pieces of duct tape that were found either in the garbage can or on the tarp that was found in item C.
The roll of duct tape physically fit back to one of the pieces on the tarp, and yes, those other pieces also physically fit to each other as well.
And thankfully, the lab took some photographs of this.
Yes,
Okay, so there's the fit between C2A and C2C.
C2A and C2C and C1A.
Okay.
Yes,
And then C2A and C2C, that one's connected as well.
yes,
And you were able to determine that was, in fact, a physical fit.
yes,
And then C2A and H being the roll of duct tape.
yes,
And you were able to determine that was a physical fit.
yes.
When you determine this, are you looking at it just with the naked eye? Are you looking at it any closer? What are you doing?
So my first step in examination is to visually look at it. Again, I'm looking for sort of general class characteristics, so the width of the duct tape, the color of the duct tape. Then I'll use a microscope to examine the evidence in a little more detail, to look closer at the broken edges, to determine, again, if the broken edges could physically fit back together.
And in this case, this is what we talked about, that one continuous piece of tape.
Yes,
And is it your opinion that item H fits into C2A, which fits into item C2C?
yes,
Talk about another report, exhibit number 424. Here you examined a couple of different items, one being a broken saw blade and one a bow saw frame.
yes,
Okay. Show you what's been marked in this case as exhibit number 141. Is that the broken saw blade that you examined?
yes,
And it's sealed, correct?
yes.
All right. I'm going to show you what's been marked in this case as exhibit number 226. We don't have to open it, but is this the Bosoff frame labeled item AG that you examined?
Yes.
Okay. And for everyone's benefit, I'm including exhibit number 113, showing the saw blade. It's already been received into evidence. Exhibit 224, showing that Bosoff frame found at the Irwin Road property, or excuse me, found at Oak Springs. The lab photographed that broken saw blade,
Yes.
and is this that photo?
Yes.
The blade was broken at one end,
Yes.
and is that a close-up of the broken end?
It is.
Now, the Bosoff frame, did it have a piece of metal that appeared to be a broken end of a saw blade?
It did.
Right. And is that what we're looking at in this slide?
Yes.
And is that item perhaps a bit closer up?
Yes.
Okay. So you then, having all of these items, you perform some analysis on the very tip of a blade that was left on that Bosoff frame that was at the Halderson house. You looked to see if it matched the saw blade that was found out at the Irwin Road farm. You looked to see if those were a physical fit.
Yes.
And what was your analysis?
So again, I looked at the items visually. I looked at the broken ends. Then I used a microscope, and I was able to determine that there was a physical fit between the saw blade and the small piece of blade that was removed from the saw frame.
And photographs were taken of this.
Yes.
What are we looking at there?
So that's the small piece on the left-hand side is from the frame, and then the end of the blade, and that's the physical fit that you can that I determined existed between those items.
Is that another closer up view, but maybe a different angle of that same thing?
Yes.
And what are we seeing there that we maybe couldn't see in the prior photograph?
So with this item, it appeared that when it broke, it bent before it broke. So this is just a sort of like a 3D physical fit.
There, we're looking at just a different angle of the same fit.
Yes.
And there as well.
Yes.
Based on looking at that item, you're comfortable saying, though, that those two items are in fact a physical fit?
Yes.
No further questions?
Cross-examination?
No, thank you.
May this witness be excused and released.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
If you have any exhibits, nope, go right ahead, then have a good rest of your day. Time. We're going to break for the day. It's been a concentrated day, and the state will continue its presentation tomorrow. Obviously, during the time that you're away from this room, please, once again, don't discuss the case with anyone, don't engage in any research, don't look at any news reporting or media regarding the case, or accidentally be exposed to any information about the matter. Your notebooks will be in here, and I'll see you tomorrow morning at the same time as always. Thank you.
All right, Gary.